Now, for more on Brexit, I'm joined by Aurel Braun, live from Toronto. He's a professor of international relations and political science at the University of Toronto. Welcome to the show.
Hello.
So, as we saw, another resounding no to another deal put forward by Theresa May, including from pro-Brexit members of her own Conservative Party. So, what options are still on the table at this point?
There are not many good options. There will be a vote tomorrow, and this will be on a no Brexit deal. It appears that that will be defeated. And in that case, Mrs. May will have to ask for a delay, and she will go to Brussels with a very, very weak hand. She has to then basically prove to the EU that Britain has good reason to ask for that delay. There would have to be an approval by the other 27 members. It has to be done unanimously. The delay would not be a very long one because there is also an election to the European Parliament on May 23rd. And I think the other members of the EU would like to know where Britain stands by that point. So Britain is in a very, very difficult situation. And it is a reflection of the kind of clash between those who push for globalization and those who emphasize the nation state.
So how much patience do you think the EU will have when it comes to not just extending the discussions, but also the pace of the progress that's now being made in these final stages?
Well, in many ways, the patience of the EU has been running very thin. But on the other hand, Britain is not some insignificant member of the EU. It is a key country that has decided to leave. And so the EU has an incentive to have some kind of exit that preserves some kind of linkage with the UK. That if this is a very nasty divorce that would come about, or if somehow Britain is tied for years and the frustration keeps growing, this would be bad not only for Britain, but ultimately might have a very negative effect on the EU. In some ways, the EU has been relatively intransigent, and perhaps one might say even short-sighted, because they want to make an example of Britain. They want to deter other countries from leaving the EU.
So then, from best to worst case scenario in terms of the UK economy, how would you rank an extension versus a no-deal crash out of the EU versus, of course, the option of a second referendum?
Well, let's start first with a no-deal Brexit. And many people fear, because there has not been an adequate amount of preparation for something like that, there would be at least initially chaos in terms of bringing food supplies, in terms of exports. And this could be worked out over the long term, but in the short term, this could be very difficult. And this is why most people suspect that that possibility, that option tomorrow will be turned down. It's not a certainty, but it's highly unlikely that that would take place. Now, if there's a delay, the question is what the delay would be for and what will be done during that particular period of delay. In each case, the EU economy, but especially the British economy, would be affected. But Britain does have other options. United States, for example, the current administration has offered to Mrs. May and the British administration the possibility of having a free trade agreement with Britain. So there could be some reorientation of British trade. And for Britain, it's a very complex problem because, as you know, there is the Irish backstop. And it's a very delicate relationship. If it was just Britain, there could have been a much cleaner exit. But that Irish backstop creates the possibility of either a kind of separation de facto of Northern Ireland, which is not acceptable, especially to the DUP party in Northern Ireland, or that somehow the EU will continue to have a hold over Britain. So it's a terrible, terrible mess. And I think none of the parties, whether it's Britain on the one hand or the EU, has behaved with terribly much of an imagination or sufficient flexibility.
Now, we've heard what lawmakers don't want, but how are British people themselves feeling about how all this is playing out?
Well, it's almost like there are two Britons. If you look at places like London and so on, which have become more globalized, where people have benefited from membership in the EU, where they don't have as many concerns about manufacturing jobs, about agriculture and so on, the Remainers have been very, very strong. But elsewhere in Britain, and you see this in other parts of the world, there's a concern about losing national identity. There's concern about an uneven sharing of the benefits of globalization. There's a concern about immigration. This was one of the great fears, that Britain could be inundated with immigrants, not just from the continent, but from various war zones, as in Syria, where Mrs. Merkel decided to take in over 1 million refugees. And so there were those in Britain who feared that they would have a loss, or they would not be able to have adequate control over economic policy and over immigration.
All right, thank you so much for your insights. Aurel Braun there, Professor of International Relations and Political Science at the University of Toronto.